A Box for the Silence. By J. W. Steele. Dr. Brian Vance had spent the better part of 20 years guiding people through grief. He'd counseled widows, soothed addicts, and walked parents through the slow decay of watching their children forget their own names. But nothing prepared him for the silence that followed his own son's suicide. Not the loud kind, the kind you hear in wailing mothers or shattered fathers. This was the cold, layered silence that folds into your bones and waits for you in every hallway. It was in the clink of coffee mugs left unwashed. The dusty corners of a teenager's room frozen in time. The silence didn't scream. It watched. 6 months passed in that fog. No calls. No clients. No appetite. And then one morning, a white envelope slid under his door. Clean font. Minimalist logo. A hummingbird over a stylized brain stem. Project Echo, emotional recovery through EEG-driven reconstruction. We believe closure isn't just psychological, it's neurobiological. We can help you say goodbye. Brian recognized the sender, the Institute for Neural Integration and Grief Studies. A controversial group on the fringes of acceptable science. He'd once criticized them in a journal editorial, calling their work wishful circuitry wrapped in lab coats. But now, he just wanted to sleep through a night without waking to Caleb's laugh echoing in the walls. He signed the waiver that same night. The therapy room smelled like sterilized plastic and lavender diffuser oil. At the center sat a padded chair surrounded by sensor rigs and a small clear cube, about the size of a toaster oven. Inside it, a lattice of gold wires, thin as hair, drifting in pale blue gel. It pulsed faintly with a heartbeat rhythm. A woman entered, crisp lab coat, calm eyes. Dr. Mara Liang, Director of Neural Operations. She extended her hand without a smile. Dr. Vance. Thank you for trusting us. Let's call it desperation, he replied. She gave a brief nod, as if she understood the weight behind it. Have you brought an object of imprint? She asked. Ethan reached into his coat and pulled out a cassette player. Old, scuffed. A cheap model with silver buttons that stuck halfway down when pressed. This was Caleb's, he said. He used to record himself playing guitar. Never finished a song. But he always tried. Dr. Liang took it gently and placed it on a tray beside the neural cube. Emotional resonance is strongest when linked to auditory memories. This will help stabilize the echo. She motioned to the chair. Wires snaked toward him like cautious vines. He sat, and they found his skin. She fastened the EEG crown over his head and adjusted the feed. You may experience mild disorientation, she said. The echo process isn't playback. It's relational recall. The neural pattern you'll speak to isn't Caleb, it's the echo of how your brain encoded him, magnified by your unresolved emotion. And if I want it to be him? Brian asked softly. Then you'll make it so. She stepped behind the glass partition and gave a thumbs up. The lights dimmed. A soft vibration moved through the floor, then into his chest. Then, the sound began. Dad. The voice came cracked and distant, like it was climbing out of water. Brian's throat tightened. He knew that voice, even distorted. The way Caleb's pitch dipped when he was unsure of himself. The slight drag in the syllables. It wasn't a recording. Behind the glass, Liang murmured, emotional convergence peaking. Echo is self-stabilizing. The room began to fade. Colors shifted. Walls folded like paper. Brian blinked, and found himself sitting in Caleb's old bedroom. The same posters. Aliens playing saxophones. A lava lamp half filled with black fluid. A pile of guitar picks spilled across the desk. And there, on the bed, sat Caleb. He looked 17 again. Legs crossed, hoodie sleeves pulled down over his fingers. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. "I didn't know how else to come," Brian whispered. "You came too late." Dr. Liang's voice crackled over an unseen speaker. "He's anchoring a temporal echo. You're inside a core emotional loop." Brian ignored her. Caleb stared down at his hands. "You used to talk to your patients for hours. You always knew what to say to them." "I didn't know how to talk to you," Brian said. "You didn't try. I thought giving you space was helping." Caleb looked up, eyes full of sadness. "Space is where the silence lives, Dad. And you fed it." The air thickened. The room shimmered at the edges. The cube on the lab table pulsed red. Suddenly, the cassette player on the desk began to play. Click. A guitar chord. Then silence. Then a whisper, "I don't think I'm real." Brian's head snapped toward it. "What did you say?" Caleb was gone. Only the voice remained, floating. "I don't think I'm real. But if I remember pain, isn't that something?" The room twisted. Walls melted. A second presence crept in, unseen, but felt. Dr. Liang's voice spiked. "Secondary signal detected. That's not part of the imprint." The temperature dropped. Faint whispers in languages Brian didn't know slithered through the air. And then, a mirror appeared on the far wall. It wasn't there before. In it, Brian saw himself. Older. Haggard. But something was wrong. His reflection blinked a half-second late. "You're not outside the mirror anymore," Brian said. "You're inside the silence." The EEG crown sparked. Behind the glass, Liang shouted, "You're crossing cognitive threshold. You need to let go." Brian stepped toward the mirror. But it shattered. Behind it stood Caleb again. No longer 17. Now 30. Wiser. Sadder. Almost parental. "You came to say goodbye," he said. Brian nodded. "I came to say don't." "Don't what?" "Don't let me disappear. I'm not just memory. I'm what's left behind." The cassette player rose into the air inside the cube. Spinning. Glowing. Whispering. "We are the silence. We are what you refuse to hear." The chair beneath Brian vanished. He fell into blackness. He woke with a jolt. Back in the lab. Chair intact. Sensors still humming. Dr. Liang was sitting beside him now, a tissue pressed to her nose. Blood trickled down her lip. She looked pale. "The session ended itself," she said quietly. "That doesn't happen." Brian looked around. The cube was dark. The cassette player was gone. Brian didn't speak. Just nodded, stood, and walked out into the pale morning light. That night, he returned to his house. The same quiet halls. The same dust. But the silence was different now. Not cold. Not accusing. Just listening. He went to bed. And on his nightstand, where there had been nothing, sat a cassette player. The same one. He was sure of it. It was rewound. He pressed play. Dad? Clear. Calm. Certain. And for the first time in months, Brian didn't cry. He answered. "I hear you."